The first time I did this, they invited me to come and speak for Young Adults Week, and I didn't know about the taping and the YouTube. so I came in thinking, oh yeah, this will be. I'll just go in and talk for a bit, and then they hooked me up and turned the camera on. I thought, oh, this feels very formal. So, how are you folks doing this week? They always introduce me as Russell or Dr. Kolts, but please, it's Russell, right? So, I don't need the doctor bits. So, how long has the week been going? How long have you been at the Abbey? Since when? Monday. Okay, great. It's been kind of warm. Making do. Well, welcome. It's nice. I'm glad to see so many of you here, and I'm glad to see you doing this. This is a really special place. There aren't very many places like this in the United States. I think it's probably fair to say there aren't that many places like this in the world, right? So it's a very special place, and that was clear to me the first time I came. So, as was said in my introduction, my work is in the area of compassion and compassion-focused therapy. So I thought I'd talk about that a little bit today, and I'll make some comments, and then it's my hope that we'll kind of transition into some discussion, because what I'm really interested in is what would be helpful to you in terms of your lives, right? And having like happy, healthy lives, and being able to kind of move your lives in the direction you want them to go in, right? So, and particularly in directions that help make the world a better place, and that help you live according to your values, those sorts of things. Okay. So, compassion is really about what we do when we run into suffering. Have you talked about compassion much this week? Not much? Not too much. Good. It's always a little intimidating coming to talk about compassion at a Buddhist monastery, because they've been talking about compassion for quite a long time. There are several people here who are probably much more qualified to speak about it than I am. But some of the work I've done has been my kind of piece of CFT. I'm known for a couple things. One of them is helping to train people to do compassion-focused therapy as a therapy. And the other is kind of applying compassion-focused therapy and kind of compassionate ways of working to anger. And so I've done a lot of talking about compassion with people who struggle with anger, with people like men in prison, things like this. And when you have those sorts of conversations, what you find out is that a lot of times people sometimes carry some ideas about what compassion is that represent obstacles for them or barriers. And so, for example, a lot of folks that I've met with initially, they don't like, when they hear the word compassion, I mean, when the first group I ran in the prisons, I got literal eye rolls. Right, the first day when I talked about compassion, you were going to use compassion to work with anger. And these guys are like, there are a couple of them that are like, okay, whatever, go ahead, silly man, come in here looking like a hippie, talking about compassion. This is going to be fun. We're going to have some fun with you. Yeah, but because these guys had this idea that compassion was really, I think in their minds it was kind of pink and fluffy, compassion, like you're just really sweet and nice all the time. And if it's compassion for others, then you're just giving them everything they want, whatever they want, you're doing it for them. You're just being really nice and sweet all the time. And if it's compassion for yourself, then it's really indulgent, and you're not like holding yourself to a standard or things like that. And so people have these ideas, and I think it can get in the way. Have you ever had any ideas or heard anyone I mean, a lot of times in everyday life, people don't necessarily talk about compassion that much. But maybe you've heard or had that sense in yourself, oh, compassion. Maybe some of them, I've even had other psychologists, oh, compassion-focused therapy. You must be really nice. And I'm always like, well, I am quite nice, but not all the time. But that's really not what it's about. So as I started, compassion is really about what we do when we see suffering. And that can be suffering in other people. It can be suffering in like people the world away. It can be people in our country. It can be people in our communities. And it can be also what happens when we see suffering in ourselves. What do we do then? And there's a term that's been around. I don't know if she coined it, but she certainly popularized it. A friend of mine named Kristen Neff popularized the term self-compassion. And self-compassion is really nothing terribly special. It's just compassion applied to the self. And my interest as a psychologist who focuses on compassion isn't any more on self-compassion than it is for compassion for others. My interest, I think, is consistent with the Buddhist interest, which is the idea that the best way to cultivate compassion is to have compassion for everybody, right? And that includes the self. Does that make sense? And I think a lot of people sometimes exclude the self. I think they've got me doing a Bodhisattva's breakfast corner, the little 5-minute talk before lunch. And I think what I'm going to talk about today is self-compassion and how it can be useful. And I'll talk about that with you a little bit too. But sometimes you hear people say things like, "You can't have compassion for others unless you have it for yourself," or "You can't love." Have you ever heard anyone say that? You can't love anybody else until you love yourself. Right? And then I've heard people say, kind of extend that to compassion. You can't have compassion for others unless you have it for yourself. And in my experience, that is absolutely not true. It's just not. Because I work with a lot of therapists, and psychologists, and social workers, and master-level therapists, and nurses, and people like this who have tremendous compassion for other people. Right? When they see other people suffering, they really feel for them and they want to help. And yet, when they notice themselves struggling or suffering, what most commonly shows up for them is criticism or dismissal or something like that. Right. So maybe before I get into defining exactly what compassion is and kind of unpacking a little bit, maybe I'll use a kind of a common thing we do in compassion-focused therapy when we're working with people who may be a little reluctant to apply compassion, or at least to apply compassion to themselves. I'll just tell a little story, give you a little vignette, and then I'll ask you a couple stupid questions and maybe one not so stupid question. Does that sound all right? Okay. So I'd like you to imagine that there's a child that you really care about. Maybe it's your child, or maybe it's a niece or a nephew or a neighbor kid, or just a child that you really love and would only want the best for, right? And I want you to imagine that this child is learning an inherently difficult task. They're learning something that's really hard, like, I don't know, playing a musical instrument, or learning a language, or playing tennis. Does anyone play tennis? Anyone plays tennis? Yeah. Racquetball. Racquetball is like tennis, only not as hard. I love racquetball too. The reason I mention tennis is tennis doesn't look that difficult, but if you ever try it, it's really hard. Right? It's surprisingly hard. Racquetball is a little easier just because the walls, right? They keep the ball from going, choo! That's right, me too. But so you've got this child who's learning this really, really difficult task. And in the first case, I want you to imagine this child has a really harsh, critical teacher. And we can even imagine, hopefully you've never had a teacher like this. Most of us at one time or other may have, hopefully you haven't, but they exist, I'm told. So imagine this child has a really harsh, critical teacher. And we might even imagine how this teacher might interact with the child. Right? Maybe, no, wrong again. What's wrong with you? Why can't you get this right? No. I don't even know why I waste my time. Are you stupid? Is that why you can't do this? What is wrong with you? No, not like that. Stupid like this. No. Right? So that's the critical teacher teaching the child. Right. So, in the second case, I want you to imagine the child having a compassionate teacher. Right? This compassionate teacher is kind. Like you, she or he cares about the welfare of this child. This compassionate teacher is also wise, understanding that all that she or he really needs to do is to help support the child, to encourage the child to keep struggling, understanding that when you're learning a very difficult task, that's what you've got to do to get better, right? That no one is automatically good at it, and that the key to improving is just struggling until you start making improvements, right? And this teacher is fairly confident that if she or he can encourage the child to continue struggling, that eventually progress will come, right? And we can imagine how this compassionate teacher might interact with the child in a way that's very different to the critical teacher. There you go. There you are. Keep going. That's great. Not quite like that. More like that. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Keep going. That's it. I'm really proud of you. This is really hard, and you're really working. It's tough. Just keep going. That's all you have to do. Nice work. Right? So, 2 teachers. And to go with the 2 teachers, a couple stupid questions. Right. First, this child that you care so much about, if you got to choose which teacher that child had, 1 or 2, hold up fingers. Which teacher would you rather have? Okay, I'm seeing 2s. That's very encouraging. If you were holding up 1s and you're here at a Buddhist monastery, I'd say, how did you get here? What brought you here for this? Okay, so let's say, however, that's the first kind of silly question. So everyone agreed you'd prefer this child you care about have the compassionate teacher. Okay, so let's imagine that this isn't a child that you particularly care about, except insofar as you kind of care about all children, right? But you don't have any special relationship with them. You don't have any great, unique investment in their individual well-being, right? But you are interested in them learning the task. You want or need them. You're invested in them learning whatever this task is. So again, which teacher would you rather they have, 1 or 2? 2. So all 2s. So now you've told me 2 things. You've told me if your concern is the welfare of the child, you would prefer they have the compassionate teacher. You think the compassionate teacher would be better. And you've told me, almost irrespective of the welfare of the child, if your concern is them learning the task, that you think the compassionate teacher would be better as well, right? Okay, so 3rd question. When you observe yourself struggling, which teacher does the voice in your head sound most like? I've got a 3, I've got some 2s, I've got several 1s. We got varying, right? Sometimes this, sometimes this, right? So it was interesting. Every other question I asked, it was all 2s. And probably 2/3 of you just now were holding up 1s, right? At least a 1 or a 1 and a 2, or there was a 3. Tell me about your 3.
Well, I was going to say, because depending on the task, I tried to take the middle route, but I didn't want to.
Yeah, you didn't want to put me off, yeah. I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, I think, that when we think about it, now it's kind of a setup, right? Because when you think about a child, and when you're doing that sort of vignette, you can't just ask the people. Going through modeling what the interaction might look like, I think, is important. But I think a lot of us do that when we see ourselves suffering, or when we're frustrated, or when we're in a hurry. Things like that, we're much more likely to shift into critical mode. And if you've ever had that harsh teacher, if you ever had experiences with someone who, right when you're struggling, they actually turn up the pressure through criticism rather than turning it down, does it help? No, it doesn't. It doesn't help. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, actually, of one of the reasons why it doesn't help has to do with how our brains work and how our brains actually were shaped by evolution to kind of organize our experience, and what happens when experiences of threat are introduced to how all that happens. But before I go any further, I want to actually talk about a working definition of compassion. So what is compassion? You know, I've already anchored it to suffering. Compassion is what we do when we come into face with suffering. But there are lots of things we can do, right, when we come into face of suffering. We can blame others. We can blame ourselves. We can criticize. We can distract ourselves, right? We can turn the channel. We can just, I'm not going to think about that. We can numb out with drugs or alcohol or the internet. Just turn on YouTube, you know, whatever. I'm not knocking YouTube, by the way. Right? Like anything, YouTube can be used, well, not like anything, but like many things. YouTube, you know, I think there's a lot of good stuff on there. And when I'm working with clients, sometimes we'll talk about helping them find like positive things they can do in their lives. And, you know, if it's like watching a program or doing things like that, you know, these things can serve different functions depending on how we use them. Right? We can watch a program because this is something that really brings us joy or really teaches us something that helps our lives. Or we can watch it to numb out, to just zone out so we don't have to think about whatever that stuff is that's bothering us. Right? So a lot of that's how we use it. But, you know, I just listed off a variety of different ways of dealing with suffering. And all of those different ways, you know, blaming, shaming, distracting, numbing out, are not terribly helpful. They're pretty common, but they're not terribly helpful. And the reason they're not terribly helpful is they don't address the causes and conditions that produce the suffering. Right? They don't reduce the suffering. They don't change anything about the situation. And actually, at this point, I want to make a distinction between pain and suffering. And I think this is really important. Pain is you know, or discomfort is just part of having a human life. It's just the way it is. Right? As we go through life, we're all going to get sick, we're all going to die, we're all going to lose people we love. We're all going to desperately want things to be one way and have them turn out another way. We're all going to work really hard in the service of pursuing goals and then be disappointed, have it not work out. Right? We're all going to fail. Most of us will get our hearts broken, not once, then several times. So there are lots of sources of pain, and that's just kind of how it is to have a human life. And in Buddhism, they talk about this quite a lot. Right? This pain, and to an extent, the suffering that goes with it is inevitable. But what happens is when pain shows up in our lives, we can relate to it in lots of different ways. And in my experience, when we ignore it, or when we get upset about having it, or we spend hours and hours thinking about how awful it is that we have to put up with it, or we blame it on ourselves or other people, or we ruminate about it, those are the things that turn pain into suffering, right? Into this thing that colors our lives. But there are other ways of dealing with pain and discomfort, I think, that can minimize the extent to which it is transformed into this kind of enduring kind of suffering. And I think compassion is probably the best way I can think of to do that. And compassion is really about allowing ourselves to notice, to be moved by suffering, and then to have the motivation to try to help alleviate it, to prevent it in the future. Does that make sense? So that's a working definition of compassion. Sensitivity to suffering, and then the motivation, and then hopefully the behavior that goes along with that motivation to do something about it. And it's important to note, sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. Right? Sometimes the behavior that goes along with the motivation of reducing suffering is around accepting the pain as an inevitable part of life. Saying, oh yeah, this is the way it is. Right? Or this is the way it is right now. Given that, what would be helpful? So, any thoughts so far? I'm aware that I've been talking for a while. Anything that's come up for you? Questions? No? Okay, well, I'll talk. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So suffering is not inevitable. Like you can have pain, but not suffering.
I think some suffering is probably. I don't think in any individual situation. And granted, in some ways we're splitting hairs here, pain versus suffering. I wouldn't work too hard in getting caught up in those distinctions. But I think of suffering as something that's more sticky and enduring, and that we tend to get stuck in. So I think in many situations, pain is inevitable, and suffering, the way I define it, the way I think about it, may or may not be, depending on how we relate to the pain and how we work with it. I would say in life, some amount of suffering is absolutely inevitable. Right? We're all going to suffer some. Right? I think, and a lot of that suffering, as you learn in Buddhism, is associated with attachment. Right? So most of us, when we lose someone we dearly love, there's some suffering that goes along with that. Right? There's pain that will always go along with that, but so I think there's this distinction it's useful to make, because I think we don't want to say pain or suffering is bad, right? And particularly with pain or painful emotions, I don't even think it's helpful to think of these as something that we need to get rid of, right? But something that it's useful to work with, right? So we can, for example, change our propensity, our relationship to anger, what we do when it comes up in us. And actually, through training our minds, we can make it much less likely that anger comes up, and so it comes up much less frequently. But I guess if you're a Buddha, right, if you become enlightened, maybe you're going to have a complete absence of anger. I've never met anyone like that. I've never met anyone who has a human life who it's completely eradicated. They never experience it. I think I'm trying to remember the story His Holiness told once, I think involving a mosquito or something like this, that something happened even, not so long ago, where he noticed a spike of, something like that coming up in him. But I think the reason I want to mention this is that I think it's a worthwhile goal to say, I want to work with suffering to try and reduce the causes and conditions of suffering in my life and in the world. But I think it's a misguided thing to think that maybe we can do this by just getting rid of all the pain. Right? If I just got rid of all the pain, then the suffering would be gone. And I think that's like the absolute wrong way to go around about that. And the reason is twofold. One, we can't get rid of all the pain. Because having a human life means there's going to be painful stuff that happens, right? And that painful stuff has to do with lots of different things. And the second is if our motivation is to get rid of the pain, then that sets us up to work with the pain in ways that actually increase suffering, because that's what sets us up to numb out, to avoid it. When the pain shows up, if my motivation is I got to get rid of it, well, one way to get rid of it is by turning to alcohol or drugs. Right? One way to get rid of it is to go do something to distract myself so I don't have to deal with it. Right? And in the moment, or to do any other sort of avoidance sort of things that we can do to keep ourselves from feeling what there is to be felt right there. But the problem is that the causes and conditions that lead to that pain aren't impacted if I go get intoxicated, right? It doesn't help anything, right? So I think if we're trying to reduce suffering by getting rid of all the pain, it's not going to work. We're wasting our time, and very likely we're making things worse. On the other hand, compassion begins with actually accepting that pain is a big part of the human condition. Discomfort happens. And for some of us, it happens a lot. For most of us, it happens a lot in various kind of levels and forms and things like this. And what compassion is about is it actually starts with acceptance of that pain and discomfort. It actually starts by saying, oh, wow, this is really uncomfortable. This really hurts. This is really hard. This is how it is right now. And it hurts. That's the sensitivity of compassion. Right? And I like to think of that sensitivity, actually. The sensitivity to suffering is having two parts. One, it shows up on our radar. We notice it. We notice there's pain in us or in others. And particularly in others, it's easy to not notice. It's easy to just not pay attention. But I think a lot of the suffering and the pain that's caused in the world, that's caused by humans, and quite a lot of it is caused by humans, isn't so much caused by people who want to hurt others, who want to cause harm, as it is caused by people who they have their goals. They have this thing that I want to do, right? And they get so kind of locked into that goal that the suffering that it's going to cause other people or even themselves, it doesn't show up on the radar. They don't notice it. They're not sensitive to it. Does that make sense? So the first thing we have to do is, if we're going to be compassionate, is to be courageously willing to see suffering where it is. And to say, this hurts. Look at the pain they're feeling. Look at the pain I'm feeling. And in the case of self-compassion, that's actually, I think, where the spot that allows us to begin working on ourselves in ways that can help us be better when it comes to things like anger, or whatever that thing is you do that doesn't fit with your values. Whatever that thing is we do that's not the person I want to be. So for me, that thing was anger and irritability. Right? That's the thing I've struggled with. Right? We all kind of will have, not all of us, but people have different things that they struggle with. And some of that's due to temperament. Right? Temperament, just one way of talking about it is just, some people are born having an easier time feeling certain emotions or experiences than others. So if you've ever been around babies, you'll know there's some happy, smiley babies that never seem to be bothered by anything. And then there are some babies that just get frustrated and irritated very easily. Right? Which of those babies is easier to love, by the way? Yeah. If you've got the happy, smiley baby, everyone wants to pick them up and hold them. If You got the fussy baby. Maybe let mom hold on to him. Right? So even from the moment of birth, those temperaments that the babies have, but they didn't get to choose, they didn't get designed, right? How many of you would have been born the fussy baby if you had the choice? None of you. Why? Because you know that happy, smiley baby is going to have an easier go of it in life, don't you? Both in terms of what they're feeling, but also in terms of how the world interacts with them. Because even from the moment of birth, what we put out there shapes how people respond to us. Right? So, some of us will have nice, easygoing temperaments. I know of a couple people like this that, if you ran over their toe with a car, they go, what'd you do that for? Right? But many of us have very different temperaments. So for me, for example, my temperament, and actually this isn't a big issue for me now because I've worked for this quite a lot, but I have to be careful because if I do well on 7 or 8 hours of sleep. If I have 5 hours of sleep, I have to pay real attention or I'm going to be a jerk. Right? If I get not enough sleep, then every little thing kind of irritates me. And it's real easy for me to inadvertently, I'll be sitting in my office working, And it's during my office hours, which are set aside for students to come see me, right? So it's there. My door's open, right? And yet I'm right in the middle of working and someone shows up at my door. Dr. Kolts, you got a second? You know it, right? I've trained myself. In that moment, there's a spike of irritation, particularly if I haven't had enough sleep. So I take, how can I help you? Right? Because they deserve my help. That's what that time is for. And I love my students. I want to help them. But in that moment, my temperament, is such that when I'm locked in and I'm doing something and something interrupts it, there's a spike of irritation. There's a voice in the back of my head that says, why won't they leave me alone? Right? And all they're doing is what they should be doing, right? They're students. They're getting help because they want to learn. That's the whole thing. It has nothing to do with them. It has to do with the fact that I've got kind of an irritable temperament, right? Other people don't struggle with that at all, but have more anxious temperaments. Right? So they notice feelings of anxiety or fear or worry, tendencies to worry, come up in them real easily. Right? And maybe even like on a daily basis, maybe frequently. There's some people who have like low-level kind of anxiety a lot of the time. Some people who it's real easy to even have extreme fear. And the part of, in compassion-focused therapy, by the way, just to do a slide aside, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to make it a little more solid here. Part of the basis for self-compassion and compassion for others and compassion-focused therapy is this recognition that those tendencies, those tendencies we have, the temperaments, our tendency to experience different emotional experiences more easily or less easily, we didn't get to choose or design those, did we? Right? Those aren't our fault. And I want to say that if you struggle with these things, that's not your fault. Right? And that's not me like trying to let you off the hook of anything. In CFT, when we say it's not your fault or it's not my fault, what we mean is let's not blame or shame ourselves or others for choices they didn't make or things they didn't design. Right? And the problem with that is if you get caught up in blaming or shaming, what are you not doing? Well, you're not working helpfully with whatever the thing is. So for me, actually, for many years, I would notice myself becoming irritable or getting angry. And what would happen afterwards would be like a number of different variations of what, as a psychologist, I would call avoidance, right? So if the irritation or anger had been caused or triggered, you notice how I corrected that? From caused to triggered? Not the same thing, right? No one else ever causes my anger. sometimes behaviors other people engage in trigger it because of my own previous conditioning, right? You notice how I'm redefining that to take the blame away from them, right? Because no one has the power to cause an emotion in me. But lots of things can happen that can trigger, depending on my history, trigger this tendency to experience it, right? So if another person would do something that triggered my anger, the form of avoidance that it would take would be blaming them. Well, I only reacted like that because you did da-da-da-da-da. Right? How many times have you heard people do that? Right? Or, rationalizing. Talk to a friend, I have the right to be angry about this, right? Right? I like to say we have the right to drink poison too. It's just not very good for you. Right? Or just, again, kind of distracting myself. Just okay, I'm going to stop thinking about that now. That way I reacted that doesn't fit with who I want to be. I'm not going to think about that. So I can go back to convincing myself that I'm a great guy. Because if I pay attention to that, I don't feel like a great guy. Actually, I feel like a really crappy guy. Right? Which is the last way that I would avoid it. When I actually would look at it and think, actually, I'm a crappy guy. I'm a jerk. I'm a lousy father. I'm a lousy husband. Because good friends and people and fathers and husbands, they don't act like that. They don't feel like that. So shame, right? Beating ourselves up for what we don't like about how we behave and what we do, can be another form of avoidance. Because there's a difference between working with whatever the experience is and beating ourselves up. Sometimes we attack ourselves, almost like we feel like if I attack myself enough about that, I will change. Right? So if I tell myself I'm a bad mother, or I'm a bad partner, or whatever, enough, I'll change. Right? What do you think? Does it work that way? No. No, in the face of shame, we don't tend to be motivated to do better. We tend to shut down. Or kick back into one of those. Shame, I think shame, and I think at this point it's useful to talk about what shame is. Shame is when and shame can be kind of internal or external. Internal shame is when I have the thought, I'm bad, right? External shame is when I have the thought, they think I'm bad. And it can take various forms, and a lot of the different forms shame can take are something to the effect of, there's something wrong with me, right? Like with a capital W. And I'm convinced that that's one of the most painful thoughts and experiences that a person can have. There's something wrong with me. I'm bad, or there's something wrong with me that makes me bad. Or there's something happened to me that means there's something wrong with me, or there's something happened to me that makes me bad. We see this sometimes in people who have gone through trauma. The fact that this happens to me must mean something about me. Or the fact that this happened to me changed me, soiled me, altered me in such a way that I'm now bad. Right? And shame's sticky, and it's painful. And in my experience, it almost never prompts positive action to make our lives better or to do better. I say almost because I think there's one instance in which shame can be a trigger for positive growth, and I think it's if we are mindfully aware of the shame. If we can notice, wow, I'm really feeling ashamed right now, or I'm shaming them, right? It's no more helpful culturally, if we apply this in a cultural way. And this is something, as someone who struggles with irritability and anger, that I've struggled with the last 5 or 6 months, actually. For reasons that I think I don't have to go into detail about. But, if we shame others, The fact that you did this makes you bad. The fact that you voted for him makes you bad. There are a lot of good-hearted people today who think that about other people, right? And the problem with doing that, when we attack ourselves, when we attack others, when we attack anybody, one, it creates lots of other problems. But at the end of the day, it also keeps us from looking at the causes and conditions that led to this pain, this suffering, that this happened. Why did this happen? What are the things that led to this happen? If we can look deeply into suffering and understand what are the causes and conditions, what is the stuff that leads to this happening, then we can do something about it. Right? So I think the reason compassion can be so powerful in helping us to work with suffering is that it helps set us up to approach it rather than to avoid it. And not approaching with condemnation or criticism, but approaching the suffering with like kind curiosity. Like looking at suffering in others or in ourselves or in the planet or in communities and say, wow, that's really painful, that's really hard. We notice it. The second part of sensitivity is we feel something, we're moved by it. And that sets us up to want to help, to approach the suffering, to look into it, to pay close attention to see what are the causes and conditions that contribute to this pain and suffering. And then to ask, given all of this, what would be helpful? What could I do that would help with this situation? Does that make sense? So I've been talking about me and anger, so I'll just do this just slightly bit more. That was the turning point for me. When I stopped blaming, when I stopped rationalizing, and when I stopped ignoring, and when I stopped shaming and attacking myself for having it. When I was able to see my anger and see both, that, this is a problem in my life. I'm interacting with people I care about in ways that are painful to them and that don't reflect how I feel about them and that don't reflect the person I want to be. And I'm not choosing to hurt them. I'm not waking up in the morning saying, I'm going to be a hostile jerk today. I'm not. I'm not picking this. And yet, it's me that's doing that. Right? And this is very important. Sometimes people think the not your fault pieces, recognizing this is not what I want, is letting yourself off the hook. And it's not. Actually, what it's about is not shaming yourself. Because if you shame yourself, we get stuck in the shame we avoid. Right? It's about saying, well, what is causing about this? What is causing this situation? What am I doing and what can I work with here? So, paradoxically, in some ways, if we stop criticizing ourselves for what we're struggling with, it helps us struggle a little better. It helps us actually approach what we're doing and say, well, what would be helpful? Right? And for me, when I stopped saying, oh, I'm such a bad person for acting like this or for feeling like this, and I said, I've got a problem with anger and irritability. This is actually an issue for me. And I want to be a better man than I am now. What would help with that? What do I need to do? What would help me in this or that situation? And what you find is when you turn that corner from blaming or shaming or rationalizing or distracting yourself around whatever it is that you're uncomfortable with or that thing you do that you don't like. When you stop doing that and just allow yourself to be moved by the fact that you or someone else is struggling and suffering with something and ask, what would be helpful? What you find is that in many cases there's a lot of stuff that would be helpful. So in the case of anger, for decades, people, psychologists and other people have come up with helpful anger management strategies, ways of working with anger. Buddhists have lots of great ways of working with anger. Mental health people have lots of great ways of working with anger, right? I wrote a book on working with anger, but the world didn't need me to write a book of anger management strategies. The problem was we didn't have those. The problem was that a lot of people who struggle with anger weren't able to use them because they got caught up in all this other stuff I've been talking about, right? Before you can do that, we need to start with an acceptance of this pain, this suffering, this struggle, whatever it is, and say, oh my gosh, look at this. This is really hard. This hurts. And then ask, what would be helpful? Refrain from judging and labeling and condemning and say, what would be helpful? And a lot of that depends on how you make sense of things. So, you're in a Buddhist monastery. So, from a Buddhist perspective, if you take the perspective of rebirth, then all of that stuff is actually the playing out of things like karma that has been accrued in previous lifetimes, right? So stuff carries forward. So one way of making sense of our temperament or how we get to be this way is the kind of carrying forward of the momentum that was accrued during previous lifetimes of experience, right? Now, I'm a scientist, right? And I must say, I go back and forth on whether or not I identify myself as a Buddhist or not. And the reason is that actually the kind of the overlap between how I understand and make sense of the world and kind of orient my life and the Buddhist way of doing that, the overlap is probably about 95%. But the difference really is found when you come to answers to the exact question that you asked. So as from a scientific perspective, I'm much more likely to make sense of those things in terms of the way our brains were shaped by evolution and then our genetic inheritance from our ancestors. Does that make sense? And, I actually am not a crusader in terms of one way of making sense of that or another. Except insofar as I would encourage, however you make sense of it, that it not be self-attacking, right? So even if you take the Buddhist approach, I think there are different ways of taking the Buddhist approach. If you say, okay, I have this precious human life that gives me this opportunity to work with all this stuff that's built up over these lifetimes and is playing out, and so I need to kind of work with that and use these tools to work with that. I think that's really helpful. I think that if you're someone who's very shame-prone and very self-critical, if you were determined to, you could play that out in a Buddhist context as well. Well, it's only my own fault because of what I did in my previous lifetime, so I deserve all of this misery, right? And my question there is, well, is that helpful? Right? And I don't think most of the time it is. I think to say, this is, now, again, compassion isn't abdicating responsibility. So I think that actually one of the things I love about Buddhism, and that I really do believe in, although I tend to restrict it to within the context of a single lifetime, is karma, right? Cause and effect, right? If I make a choice, or if I do something, for whatever reason, if I do something, and there are consequences to that, right? Well, I did that, and these are the consequences. I don't have to like them, but it's helpful to have some acceptance of that, right? And I'm not necessarily even talking about things like breaking laws, right? If I'm nasty to you, and then you steer clear of me, that's the consequence of how I interacted with you. Right, and so that kind of helps define the system in which I now get to work. Yeah.
And our natural tendencies change.
I have two responses to that. Yeah. First, I want to qualify my previous response by saying it's not just genetics. It's also how we're shaped by our life experiences. And of course, those things interact with our genetics and how we behave, and then the universe responds, the people around us respond to us, and all of that kind of shapes who we are. So for example, the version of me you see right now is the version of me you see when I'm born to white, middle-class, educated parents who love me and nurture me and emphasize education and help me succeed in the educational world. And so at the end of that, you see the college professor, right? If I'd been born to a single drug-addicted mother in an inner city somewhere and victimized and abused during my upbringing, probably I would have turned out very differently, regardless of whatever my genetic whatever was. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, but I think your question is a really important one, which is, does the base response ever change? And I'm going to say first, as a scientist, well, I don't know. I haven't seen any data on that. Does that make sense? As a responsible scientist, I need to say that. I don't know. I haven't seen studies that say, yes, you can completely eradicate this tendency. What my best guess is that actually with mind training, we can get to the point where that thing isn't an irritant. In fact, and I can say that for me even, it doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes I'm working and something distracts me and it's like, oh, hey, you know, it's really only when I'm really focused and really locked in. And who knows, maybe that'll change one day too. I will say that, for example, a few years ago, more than a few years ago, but I never had a problem with like road rage. But every once in a while, if someone would cut me off on the freeway or something, I'd have that spike of irritation. Have you ever had that, right? Yeah, the spike of irritation. And occasionally I would say things that would make my wife look at me like, who is this man in the car with me and why did I marry him? Maybe I don't think she actually asked that question, but she would. She's like... And I will say that it really doesn't happen anymore. I mean, occasionally I'll get miffed at another driver, but that's usually like if I'm running late, my own fault, right? And someone's moving very slowly in front of me, actually following all the traffic laws. I'm like, why don't you go? But that's, even that is not, it's not like anger, it's not felt irritation, it's, So in that sense, I have seen that kind of happen, where something that used to happen, it just doesn't anymore over time. So I think that situationally and in particular contexts, if we work with them well enough, I think probably we can get to the point where that just doesn't happen anymore. Now, we also need to understand, though, and this is something I referred to very briefly at the beginning, from a scientific perspective, all the stuff that we feel is rooted to basic evolved motivations and emotions that had survival value for our ancestors, right? So while we can very much work with how we respond to anger, and to an extent what triggers it, anger and fear and disgust and other things, we have them because they're kind of wired into how our brain works, right? And they're there because for previous versions of us, for our ancestors, they had some adaptive quality, right? Our threat response systems. And this is one of the things that I think Buddhism in some ways was kind of designed to help people work with. We have really tricky brains, and we have these tendencies to respond in ways that are absolutely not helpful. Evolution put our brains together in ways that are inherently tricky, because part of the way evolution works is, it changes, but as you adapt, as your equipment changes, it's not like all the old stuff disappears, right? So we still have those very kind of primordial brain centers that really evolved to help our ancestors fight and run and escape, right, and survive in the face of real physical threats. And yet, now we live in a world, most of us, not all of us, and by I say most of us, I mean most of us in this room and most of the people who will be watching this video. Actually, you can't even say this about most of the people in the world. There are a lot of people in the world that still face lots of physical threats on a day-to-day basis. but probably most of us, most of the threats that we face on a day-to-day basis probably are not the things that are best responded to by either fighting or fleeing, right? By getting a rush of adrenaline in our bodies and our blood pressure and tensed up. And, most of the threats we face are either like social threats or, problems paying bills or, those sorts of things, or even problems in our minds that we in some sense create or trigger by the way we think about things, the way we make sense of things, right? So if you're really tired today and I interpret that as, oh, they're not interested, and then I run with that, that can be very painful for me, even though it has nothing to do with your actual experience. Does that make sense? And in the face of those sorts of problems, the way our threat response systems and emotions like anxiety or fear and anger, they don't work very well. Does that make sense? They're preparing us to do something, fighting or fleeing, that doesn't really address the situation at hand. And then we've got other tricky bits. We evolved other parts of our brains that enable us to do things like to think and assign meaning and to imagine, right? To do mental time travel, to remember and reminisce and imagine what could happen in the future, right? To think about what something means and what does it mean about me. So, one thing I like to talk about in my workshops in terms of talking about this kind of the impact of evolution on human beings and our capacity to suffer and really get stuck in these things. I like to talk about my dog, Gwen. I've got a couple dogs, Gwen and Vera Wag. Gwen's a greyhound mix, so she's very big, and Vera's a Chai weenie, so she's not. But dogs, as you know, probably are, if you've had dogs, are pretty territorial. Right? So dogs, this is my yard. Right? Yeah. We happen to live in an area of Spokane where behind our house is kind of pine forest, kind of going up a hill. And so we have a small backyard, but then we've got the pine forest. So we opted not to put up a fence so that we could sit out in the yard and just enjoy the forest. So it's nice. We have a small yard, so I don't have to do much mowing, but I can just enjoy the outdoors in a very kind of expansive, open way. So it's very nice. So we'll go out there. But we have some other neighbors who have worked with their yards in the same way. They enjoy the pine forest too. And so what happens is every once in a while, somebody's dog will wander across the neighborhood. And every once in a while, one of their dogs will wander through our backyard. Right? So imagine that happens. And imagine I'm out there and Gwen's out there too. If another dog wanders into her yard, because dogs are territorial. It was my yard, kind of like we might say, this is my house or whatever. So attachment, right? Mine. Imagine another dog wanders in. What you would see if that happened is, from Gwen's side, you'd see a threat response from her. And what would happen is that Gwen would very quickly size up this other dog, right? And if it was a situation she thought she could handle, right, like the dog was her size or a little smaller, or for whatever reason she didn't feel too intimidated, she'd probably do a threat display. She might bark or growl or kind of snarl, and her hackles would go up, and as if to say, hey, it's my yard, get out of here, right? Have you ever seen dogs do this kind of thing? Yeah. And on the other hand, let's imagine that this is a big, mean-looking dog, right? And Gwen knows that if they tussle, she's going to get the worst of it, right? What she's likely to do instead is a display of submissiveness. She's likely to make herself, have you seen a dog do this? They make themselves really small. They kind of get down like this. Kind of as to say, it's okay. No one needs to get hurt. Avail yourself of the yard, please. Right. And so let's imagine this other dog kind of wanders around the yard, sniffs, pees on a tree, whatever, gets bored and wanders off. Right. 5 minutes later, how is Gwen doing? 5 minutes later, she's fine. She's fine. Like, it's over. The other dog's gone. She's like, can I have a treat? Can I have a scratch? She's laying in the sun. She's like, well, I ran him off. Oh, yeah. Right? So she's fine. And the reason she is that she has kind of the same threat response system we have in a lot of ways. But for her, it worked exactly as evolution designed. Those threat emotions, anger, fear, things like that, were designed as rapid response systems. So they're rapid on and should be rapid off, right? Threat shows up, you experience the emotion that's kind of oriented around the motive to defend yourself, right? Your attention focuses in very narrowly on whatever the threat is, right? And then when the threat goes away, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, your blood pressure drops, your heart rate slows, and you can go back to being okay. Does that make sense? Sign. You rise to meet the occasion, threat's gone, okay, back to normal, right? That's really how the threat response systems are designed to work. The problem is we developed these fancy frontal lobes. And to demonstrate that, let me ask you, okay, now I want you to imagine your home, in your house or your apartment, whatever, or in the Abbey. The Abbey's your home. And someone you don't know just marches in your front door. They just walk in. Right? You don't know this person. They just march right in, start making themselves at home. I don't know. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but my guess is that your initial response would be very much like Gwen's. You'd size them up, right? And try to figure out, is this a situation I can handle, right? If they just look like, a college student who's had one too many and walked in the wrong apartment, and you feel like I can handle this, you might say, this is kind of my place. You're in, right? Could you go? Right? They're not getting the hint. Maybe you'd ratchet it up. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Right? On the other hand, if this person comes in and it's clear this is not a situation you're up to handling, maybe they've got a big gun. Right? You might do the human equivalent of Gwen's. Hey, no one needs to get hurt here. Right? I don't have many valuables. That's what you're looking for, but the ones I do have are in the top drawer in the master bedroom there. Just no one needs to get hurt. Right? Is that kind of how you'd respond? Yeah. So let's imagine that person, wanders in and kind of wanders around, maybe gets a drink out of the refrigerator. Sometimes when I'm doing workshops, I make a joke about pee on the couch. The dog metaphor. Too much, right? Yeah. And then they get bored and they leave, right? They're gone. 5 minutes later, how are you?
Still sweating.
Yeah. 5 hours later? Yeah. Maybe 5 days later, you're feeling a little better as you're watching them install the new home security system. Right? But what's the difference between you and Gwen? What's happening from your side that wasn't happening from hers? Yeah. Because in Gwen's mind, it's like, okay, they're gone. Back to the sunny spot. But for us, what's happening in our mind, right? We're imagining, right? We can play that event over again and again in our mind. We can assign meaning to it. It's all this conceptualization, right? What does it mean that he came here? Why me? We can imagine what he could have done. We can imagine what he might do if he comes back. We can imagine him telling his friends how easy it was to get in there, and etc., 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 etc. Does that make sense? And so what happens is this ability to imagine, to create images and words in our minds, to think, to reminisce, to imagine the future, allows us to continuously fuel a threat system that was designed to be rapid on, rapid off. right? And so we can take emotions like fear and anger that in Gwen would last just as long as the situation lasted, and we could fuel them for hours, days, or in some people, decades, right? And when that happens, things like irritability and anger can turn into things like trait hostility, right? Someone who just, I don't know if you've ever interacted with someone who that kind of goes through the life just angry or terrified all the time, you know. And so much of that is and we, again, even that, how that works is not our fault, right? It's because we've got that basic threat response stuff, and then as we evolved, we developed all this other stuff. And when those interact, it can be really tricky, right? And they can interact not only in terms of things like threat emotions, but we have other emotions too. In compassion-focused therapy, we talk about 3 systems of emotion that correspond to motivations and that are rooted in kind of the evolutionary advantages they gave our ancestors. So I've already talked about the threat system, the threat emotions, right? Fear, anger, disgust is a big one, right? And those really evolved to help our ancestors to identify, to notice, and to respond to threats. By the way, sometimes people ask me, is there anything good about anger? Sometimes people talk about anger being good. I actually, when I talk about this, I think of anger as being a wonderful sign or a wonderful signal, but a terrible strategy. If we can get mindfully good at noticing anger coming up in us, that response is usually pretty good at orienting us towards something that we find threatening, right? Or towards something that we might want to pay more attention to. So I can notice something made me really angry. Oh, that made me really angry. What's going on there? And maybe it's something about the situation, or maybe it's something about me that I need to work with. But it orients me towards what's going on. What I find is that in most situations, and by most in my life, I mean pretty much all of them, anger as a strategy that dictates my behavior doesn't help, right? In pretty much the last 46 years, and I'm 46 years old, haven't come across situations that are made better by me fighting or me becoming aggressive, right? And some people they do. Sometimes there's adaptive strategy. When you're working in the prisons, for example, one way that people in prison can keep themselves safe is by gaining a reputation for volatility and violence. Because if you have that reputation in the prisons, sometimes people will give you a wide berth. Now, the nice thing is that that's not the only way to protect yourself in that context, right? I've had people who've gone through the compassion-focused therapy groups who found other ways, who were able to actually not be hostile and violent and angry all the time, and have found other ways to protect themselves. But sometimes people will say I'm using it as a strategy. But in most cases, I think anger is not useful in making anything better, right? Sometimes I hear people talk about, but activism, right? I'm an activist, and anger is the fuel for my activism. And there was a study on that, actually. And there are probably several, but the one that I am thinking about, they actually asked this question: is anger important for activism? Is anger related to people being activists around issues they care about? And what they found is that anger was related to activism. But in an ongoing way, it was only related to activism which involved the expression of anger. So anger motivates like standing out on a street corner, holding a sign, yelling. It doesn't really motivate sitting in a hospital, holding a rape victim's hand while she goes through the examination. You know, the rape kit examination that they do. That requires compassion. Does that make sense? So anyway, what was I talking about? I jumped to anger for a little bit. I want to find my way back. Does anyone remember? Oh, the 3 systems. Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't. One of the things I don't want to say is that this emotion is good, that emotion is bad. Right? Much more useful to think about them functionally, both in terms of what was their function for my ancestors, in terms of why do I have them. And more importantly, how do they function in my life? And are they helpful? Is the way I behave when I'm really caught up in this helpful, or is it not? So the second system we talk about in compassion-focused therapy, we call the drive and resource acquisition system. I abbreviate it sometimes when I'm talking the drive system. And those are motivations that really evolve to help us pursue goals, to help us keep working hard towards what we want to do in our lives when we've identified a goal. Right? Our ancestors, if they needed to survive, they needed to find food, shelter, mates, social position, all of that. Right? Pretty much anytime you're like, ooh, I want that, or you're working hard towards your goal, and then something happens and you achieve it, right? And you feel good, right? That's drive system stuff. Now, the interesting thing to note about threat and drive systems is both of them involve a narrowing of attention and thinking and reasoning. When we're caught up in threat, like anger and fear, am I right? Right? Your focus is right there. And this is very important. Sometimes we try to motivate people or motivate ourselves, or we've had teachers that try to motivate us through threat. As a teacher, I can say that's a terrible strategy. I teach a really fun classes at Eastern Washington University, like statistics. Right? I do some some people say my statistics class is fun. I teach lots of classes. Statistics is the example I use, though, because a lot of people come into statistics, because these are social science majors I teach statistics to. A lot of them come in feeling pretty threatened already. But let's imagine that I'm trying to motivate them to study and work hard in my statistics class by making them afraid of failing. Have you ever had a teacher that did that? You're going to have to work hard or you're going to fail. Have you ever had that? People do this, right? Good. You're shaking your head. No, I'm so glad you've never had a teacher like that. Sometimes teachers would joke, you've heard the joke, well, look to your left and look to your right on the first day of class, because in a week they will be gone, right? I don't think anyone actually says that, right? It's a running joke. But I have seen teachers, and I've seen others try to motivate people through triggering threat. And jobs, right? If you don't work hard, you could lose your job. If you don't achieve this, you could be passed over for the promotion, right? The problem with trying to motivate behavior through threat is if you want someone to do something that's difficult, right, you want them to be focused on the task, right, on what they're working on. And if I threaten you, if I trigger a threat response in you, you're going to be focused all right. But are you going to be focused on what I want you to learn or what I want you to do? Or are you going to be focused on the threat? See what I'm saying? So if I go in my statistics class and I try to motivate my students by saying, you're going to have to work really hard in here, you're going to fail. This is not an easy class, right? If you don't work hard, you're going to fail. I failed like 10 students last quarter. They didn't cut it, right? So work hard at statistics. Are they going to be sitting there thinking about means and standard deviations and regression? Or are they going to be sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail. Oh my gosh, I could fail. Oh my gosh, I'm going to have to take this again. I'll lose my scholarship. What will my parents say? You see what I'm saying? Right? So that's what threat emotions do. They focus us on the threat. And that makes a lot of sense because, if you're in the savannah, like our ancestors, some of them were, and a tiger jumps up, do you want to be focused on the tiger or do you want to be going, oh look, there's a pretty flower? Right? Which one of those people is going to be eaten? Drive system emotions do that too, right? The excitement we feel after a goal, they focus us on what we want to focus on, which generally is good, right? Unless the focus is so narrow that we miss other things. Unless I'm so concerned with pursuing this goal that I neglect the people around me, or I don't care for myself or take care of myself or whatever, right? But the whole idea is these systems tend to narrow our focus either on threats or goals. Now the third system that we talk about in CFT is sometimes it's called the soothing system, or I like the term the safeness system, right? It's associated with feeling safe, peaceful, calm. And in humans, we really evolved to feel those feelings through connection with people that accept us and care about us. Right? That's when we tend to feel really safe. Now, that's if it works the way it's supposed to work. Right? If our early caregivers were able to take care of us and nurture us when we needed it. Right? If as very young ones, when we were distressed, our caregivers would come and support us and care for us, right? What the attachment researchers, not Buddhist attachment, but relationship attachment in psychology, what they would call a secure attachment, right? What happens when our caregivers consistently take care of us and are there when we need them is we learn a lot of different things. And a lot of things are relevant to compassion, actually. We learn that help will be there when we need it. We learn that other people care about us and will help. So we learn to turn to others when we need help. We learn things about ourselves, too. When others care for us and help us, we learn that we're worthy of care and being helped. And we learn to feel safe, particularly in the context of people who can be helpful to us. Now, what's tricky is if we have caregivers who, for whatever reason, aren't equipped to do that. Maybe they're caught up in addiction, or they've got their own stuff going on, or whatever's happening. Then we can learn to have a hard time feeling safe through connection with others. And, pardon me. And if we're in the situation where the people, particularly the people, other people, but particularly people that really should be caring for us, if they scare us or they hurt us, or they ridicule us when we're distressed, they make fun of us, or they just don't help, then we don't learn that people can be trusted. We don't learn to feel safe through connection. And we also can fail to learn that we're worthy of being cared about. Right? And instead we can learn that if people really know me, they won't take care of me. They won't want to be around me. We can learn to relate to ourselves with shame. Right? So, one of the things, just as an aside, I'll say to you is if you're someone who struggles to feel safe, and most particularly struggles to feel safe in relationship with others, I think it's worth thinking about that. Both in terms of, does this make sense given what I know about my background? Given what I know about my history? Does it make sense that I would struggle to feel safe or feel safe in these situations? And then to ask questions like, what kinds of things help me feel safe? In what situations do I feel safe and comfortable and calm and peaceful and things like this? And the reason that's really important, and the reason it's important for compassion, is whereas fear and even drive emotions really narrow and focus the attention on whatever the threat or whatever the drive pursuit is, when we feel safe, calm, generally content, what happens is that awareness opens wide. And instead of being so narrowly focused on that one thing, we can be more observant, we can be more reflective, we can think about things in different ways. We're better at things like perspective taking, right? If we're angry, one of the things anger is associated with is stereotyping and making kind of rash judgments, kind of blindly accepting the words of an authoritative other, particularly if what they're saying kind of agrees with what we already think. And a sense of certainty, a knowing that I am right, this is the only way. When we feel safe, suddenly we can think much more flexibly, we can imagine things from different perspectives. Well, this is kind of how I make sense of it, but I'm wondering if I were like you, if I were you, how that might feel different. Right? There are studies that show that when you can trigger these experiences of safeness in people, we're more creative, we're more pro-social, we're kinder, we're more compassionate, we're more likely to help others who are hurting, and we're more altruistic. So one way to help set ourselves and others up to work compassionately with others and with ourselves is to begin to learn to create feelings of safeness. Learning to create this experience for ourselves. And for some of us, that involves learning to feel safe in connection with others. For a lot of us, if our development has been kind of as evolution designed it to be, where our caregivers consistently care for us, we'll naturally tend to feel safe in those contexts. But if our history hasn't shaped us for that, we may have to learn it. We have to learn that actually there are people who won't hurt me. There are people who will care for me. There are people who will be there when I need them. There are people who will value me. And by the way, just because we learn that up here, just because we can think it and we say, I know this, Does that mean that we automatically are going to feel safe if we've learned to feel threatened? No. Those ancient emotional parts of our brains take much longer to adapt to feeling safe, to safe environments, than they take to adapt to threat, because our brains were biased to respond to threat, because that's what kept our ancestors alive, right? Evolution, although evolution isn't the thing that really cares or thinks, metaphorically I will say, evolution isn't concerned with the times you're safe and comfortable. That's not what keeps you alive long enough to reproduce. Evolution is concerned with keeping you alive, and that means dealing with threat, right? So that's why it's so easy for us to get caught up in these threat experiences and these thought loops where we're just completely focused, because our brains are really biased to process in that way, right? And you've been in situations, haven't you, I suspect, where everything was going great and you were having a wonderful time, and then that one thing happened that triggered anger or fear or whatever, and it just colored the whole day, right? Paul Gilbert, who actually is a psychologist in Britain, who founded compassion-focused therapy, one of his examples is, imagine that you were shopping for a holiday or for someone's birthday, or, I think it's an example. The example he uses, like you're going out shopping for Christmas, because that's when people buy a lot of gifts. And so you're going to this shop and this shop and this shop and this shop, and all these places that you go, everyone's very nice to you. And then you go to that one place, and someone's nasty or condescending or whatever, right? And then you go home at the end of the day, and your roommate, your spouse, or whoever it is says, "Well, how was your day of shopping?" What are you going to tell them about? Right? Are you going to tell them about, "Wow, I went to 10 shops and 9 of them were great"? Or are you going to say, there was this one person, right? So we're sort of biased to process threat. And so part of preparing ourselves to be able to respond helpfully to pain or discomfort, compassionately to difficult things that happen when they happen, is to be able to work with our minds when we're not in situations that are threatening, so that we can set ourselves up to have experiences of calmness and safeness, so that when that stuff happens, we don't completely get lost in the threat. And there are lots of ways of doing this. Many forms of meditation, for example, train what Western psychologists call mindfulness. And Western mindfulness practices were really kind of lifted from Buddhist spiritual approaches, and credit is given. And I always, when I talk about mindfulness, I want to say nobody in psychology invented this. Right? Really, it was probably Buddhists didn't invent it either, but they were the ones that really first, I think, systematically taught it, at least to my awareness. But it's kind of noticing, right? Noticing emotions and experiences as they come up, being able to be aware of what's happening out there and what's happening in here without getting lost in it. Because there's a huge difference between having anger or fear come up in you and getting caught up in it, versus having anger and fear come up on you and going, I'm feeling really angry about that. If I can do that, then I can go ahead and ask another compassionate question. First is, what am I feeling? The second is, well, what would be helpful? Given that, what would be helpful? Well, maybe if I slow down my breath, and talk to someone about it, or think about how I want to respond. Ask the question, what would be helpful? What's been helpful in the past? What's been useful? Things like this. So I've been talking for quite a while. So to kind of wrap up, at least this part, compassion involves sensitivity to suffering, noticing it, and being moved by it. And that suffering can be in others, it can be ourselves. I would argue even suffering in nature and the planet, or in animals, right? Anywhere, just noticing, being willing to notice it, being able to be moved by it, have a little bit of kind of heartbreak over it. Oh, wow, that hurts. There's hurt there. And then having this motivation to want to help alleviate the suffering, to want to help prevent it continuing or happening in the future. and then maybe even asking the question, what could I do that would be helpful? And ways we can set ourselves up to be able to do that through training our minds and training our bodies are things like helping create context in which we can feel safe, which can trigger those experiences in us, which opens up our ability to think flexibly and kind of connect with wisdom and learn wisdom from others, to increase our ability to be mindfully aware, to notice when these experiences happen. And that can be useful both in the situation, oh look, this is what I just thought. Oh look, this is what I just felt. What would be helpful here? Right? It's not just about feelings, it's about thoughts too. Have you ever had a task where you had to do something and you had the thought, well, I'm never going to be able to do that. I can't do that. There's no chance of that. Does that motivate you to work hard, or what does it motivate you to do? Yeah, you don't do anything. You shut down, you give up. Because if there's no way I can succeed, why should I even try, right? But let's imagine, same thought, right? You've got the big task, and you have the thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. There's no way. And let's say in that next instant, you're mindfully aware, wow, I just had the thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm feeling pretty discouraged about this right now. Does that change it? It does. Because if I see it like that, then I can ask, well, what would be helpful? I'm feeling discouraged. Why am I feeling discouraged? I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Maybe I don't have enough information. Maybe I can go talk to somebody else and get some advice and see what they think would be helpful. Maybe I could go talk to Venerable Children and see if she has any thoughts on this. You know, things like that. So being able to help ourselves feel safe, being able to notice feelings and thoughts as they come up. And there are lots of different kind of mind training you can do around that. I'll actually teach you one that I like called the mindful check-in. And what this is actually kind of a behavioral sort of technique. It's going to seem less meditative than a lot of what you'd learn in the Abbey, which is why I'm teaching it, because you don't need me to teach you meditation while you're here. Probably you've got better teachers than I to do that. But it's training, noticing. I want to ask, you don't have to raise any hands here, but sometimes people are fingernail chewers. Right? Some people chew their nails. If you chew your nails, by the way, you should really stop. It will cut your rate of illness by 50%. This is what the data say. But sometimes fingernail chewers will come see people like me. They'll come see therapists and say, I want to stop chewing my fingernails. And when they do, I want to say all good therapists would do this, but that's a lot of hubris in that statement. I would suggest to therapists, if someone comes to them wanting to quit chewing their fingernails, that you do one specific, give them one bit of homework, one intervention the first time. When someone says, I want to stop chewing my fingernails, there's one thing, I'm going to send them away with the task. Can anyone guess what that task is? For the next week. For the next week, I want you to do this before you come back. That might be nice, but no. Yeah, I want to train them to know when they start chewing. So I'm going to give them an assignment. The assignment is going to be, when you notice that you're chewing on your fingernails, keep track of it. So, back before everyone had little handheld computers in their pockets, you might give them they made these little metal tickers, and it had like a little rotating numbers on them, and a little button, so when you hit the button, it went 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You'd give them one of those. These days, they can keep track of it on their phone, or there are a million ways to do it. But the whole idea is, if every time you catch yourself chewing your fingernails, and it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, but every time you notice you're chewing your nails, just keep track of it. Notice it. Write it down. And the reason that I have them do that is that for most fingernail chewers, I haven't met anyone like this, maybe they exist, but for most fingernail chewers, in my experience, it's not so much the case that their experiences, like they're sitting there and they're looking at their hand, they're like, well, Well, I don't know. I mean, I know this is a nasty habit that will double my rate of illness. Leave my fingers disfigured. But it's just so good. Maybe just a little bit. Right? That's usually not how it goes. I mean, again, maybe one day someone will come up after a workshop and say, actually, my fingernails are very tasty, and I think about that all the time. Usually, people they're not engaging with it in this way. Usually they're distracted, they're doing something else, or they're anxious about something, and they're like, nah, 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 and at some point they notice that they're doing it. Does that make sense? And so what we want to do is, what's your name? Marin. Okay, what Marin said is absolutely right. I want to shape them to notice. Not here, but here. Because if you notice, I don't want to do that. Does that make sense? If I notice it before I start chewing, then I can choose not to. And I can begin to do something else or find a way to break the habit, find something else to do with my hands, whatever. So what that intervention is doing is training people to notice. Because what happens is after a couple weeks of keeping track of every time you chew, you begin to notice it. It trains you to orient toward that experience in such a way that you begin to notice it before you chew rather than 5 minutes later. Does this make sense? And so that's kind of the philosophy behind the mindful check-in. I actually want to do a research study, and I should qualify this by saying I don't have research data to say the mindful check-in works in exactly this way. Although I have the idea that it does, and so I'd like to actually test that out. So maybe I'll get a master's thesis student to do a mindful check-in thesis sometime so we can publish some data on it. But that's the spirit of this practice that I'm going to teach you. And all you're doing with this mindful check-in is purposefully taking your attention, taking that kind of spotlight of your attention, and bringing it to your bodily experience, to your emotional experience, to what you're feeling, and to your thinking and mental imagery. Does that make sense? You're just doing that in succession. And when we do it, we'll take a few minutes, but actually after a little practice, you can do it in seconds, like 30 seconds. You can, okay, what's going on in my body? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? And I would encourage you, if you want to begin to raise your awareness of these sort of mental experiences, so you can notice that thought or that feeling soon after it comes up, to just try and do this a few times a day. Just bring your attention to what's going on in my body, what am I feeling, what am I thinking. So just sitting here, I'll ask you, I'll just give you some instructions. Right? If you just notice the temperature, right? Notice if you're feeling warm or cool. Right? I usually start with temperature, no particular reason. Right? So as I sit here, I'm kind of noticing I'm a little warm, but not uncomfortably so. Okay. You might notice other kind of physical sensations, your feeling of your legs on the floor, your body pressing against the cushion, sensations of your arms or hands in your lap or on your legs. Just noticing those feelings. Maybe noticing any other sensations coming in from the outside world. If your eyes are open, maybe noticing color, shape, the information coming in through your eyes. If your eyes were closed, maybe you notice patterns of light on the back of your eyelids. Noticing any sounds that might be present. Right. In most rooms, you might have the heating and cooling system or a fan or people rustling outside, my voice. And here it's actually remarkably quiet except for my voice. Just noticing the sound. Sound maybe is a nice place to transition inward, so maybe follow the sound into your body and bring your attention to internal bodily sensations. Maybe feelings of hunger or fullness. Maybe some aches in your legs if you're not used to sitting cross-legged. You might notice some aching or some feeling there. Patterns of tension or relaxation. warmth or coolness. If you notice any tension in your body, you might just try to relax that as you go. And if there are any sensations in your body that call out to your awareness, you can let it go there. Just noticing, I'm noticing my right knee right now. There's a little tingle there, or a little ache. You're just noticing what's going on in your body. You may or may not right now be able to notice the beating of your heart. But I'm very sure that you can probably notice the feeling of your breath entering and leaving your body. So just allowing yourself to notice that. Breath entering the nose, filling you, leaving again. And then allowing your attention to follow the breath into your emotions, your emotional state. See if it's possible to notice what feelings you're having. Interest, boredom, confusion, contentment, frustration, anticipation. See if it's possible just to notice those kind of emotional tones as mental experience. Just as experiences in the mind. Neither good nor bad, right, wrong, just noticing, this is, as Tara Brach says, this is what it's like right now. This is how I feel right now. And since we've turned our attention to mental experiences, see if it's possible to then shift to another set of mental experiences, thoughts and imagery. Just noticing, are there any words or images in your mind? Right. And just noticing them again as words, images in your mind. Neither necessarily true or untrue, right or wrong. No, this is what I'm thinking or imagining right now. This is what I'm noticing about my experience. And when you're ready, you can allow your eyes to open. Maybe take a breath or two. So, although that took a few minutes, all I really did is have you, kind of talk you through orienting to your body, and then your emotions and your thoughts. And I think that training ourselves in this way can be very useful. Because I think a lot of the times when we get caught up with problems or stuck in different emotional states or things like this, we're not noticing that that's what we're doing. Does that make sense? A feeling comes up and we're just in it. Or a pattern of thinking comes up and we're just rolling with it. Have you had that experience where you're just kind of, caught up? And the idea is that if we can train ourselves to notice what's going on in my body, and by the way, the increasing amounts of research are showing that there's a very important relationship between bodily experience and mental experience. I mean, historically, I think a lot of people in different fields have talked about this is over here and that's over there, and they're very different. And what we're finding is actually very, very closely related, which is one of the things that, of course, the Buddhists and Buddhism has gotten right for years and years. There are a lot of precepts and a lot of ways, for example, that monastics live that are really designed to help people's bodies function well. So you're eating food that's good and healthy for you. You're getting sufficient amounts of sleep. You're not bombarding your body with poisons or intoxicants and things like that. And you're moving your body. Our bodies really were designed to move and to be active. They say, what is the word? I think my son said this to my wife a few weeks ago. Sitting is the new smoking. Right? People are dying from being sedentary because we have these jobs where we just sit for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and it's just, it's not good for us. And so, our bodies and the functioning of our bodies is very much influenced by and influencing our mental state. And there's lots of research showing how social relationships impact what's going on in our bodies, which impacts what's going on in our minds, and all of that. I actually have this fantasy, and this is a ridiculous thing to say because it's not nearly this simple. But the fantasy I have is that I wish every client who came in to me to see me for psychotherapy for an emotional disturbance, my fantasy is that we could sit down and that maybe I'd hear a little bit about their problem, but the real focus of the session would be we'd make a plan that would somehow magically, this is the simple part, right, because it's never this simple, but would somehow magically help them get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, eat healthy, non-processed food, and 20 minutes of exercise. Because, and then say, okay, if you do that for a month and you still need me, come back. Does that make sense? And the idea is that if you could do that, that actually that a lot of the problems people might not need therapy for. Now, that's the reason I say that's a fantasy is that actually a lot of the mental health issues that people are coming to see me for are the very things that would prevent them from doing those things, right? So it's not as simple as just do that. If it were, we'd all be doing those things because we all kind of know that's good for us. That's another thing. Human beings, we have a remarkable ability to understand what would be good for us and still not do it. And that's one of the reasons. I think I'll wrap up by giving a little plug for the Abbey and the way things work in Buddhism. I've talked about safeness, right? And I've talked about that compassionate teacher who helps you keep going in the face of a difficult task. Well, guess what? Life is a difficult task. And living well is a difficult task because of the pain and the difficulty that we'll all face. And what Buddhists do, I think, really well, they do a lot of things, but one of the things that I think is really important is the Sangha, the community of practitioners that I think fuels both experiences of safeness, helps us open, but also involves routines that help kind of get all the bodily stuff online and keep us moving in the right direction and supporting continued spiritual development. So I think whether or not you're a monastic or whether or not you're a Buddhist, that there's actually a lot of really good things to learn from looking at the way Buddhists and particularly Buddhist monastics live, because they've spent over a couple thousand years figuring out ways that work. And I think one way to live well or to do anything well is to look at folks who have figured out how to do it well and to learn from them.